This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Mars, the planet that we all gaze at when we see it turn red, sometimes bright red, depending upon the Martian dust storms. The fact that we gaze upon it is a way of connecting us to our ancients, our progenitors, the people who first gazed on Mars without our instruments and robots and success. Someone who tells this story wonderfully, I welcome Matthew Shindell. He is a space history curator at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, and his new book is For the Love of Mars, A Human History of the Red Planet. The ancients did not shy away from interpreting Mars, so Matt, congratulations and good evening. We go immediately to the Mayans, who looked upon Mars as a zoomor, Mars beast. What did they make of that red planet in the sky? Good evening to you.
Thank you, John. Yeah, so the story of the Mayans is very interesting. I was attracted to that story partly because the Mayans have this incredibly robust understanding of cosmology, of the role that the planets played in their world. And I really wanted to learn a little bit more while I was writing this book about how they saw Mars and what it meant to them. And in reading a lot of the anthropological literature about that relationship between the Mayans and the sky, I did find archaeologists who are making this argument that in this one particular codex, the Dresden Codex, there was a table related to the motions of Mars. And in that table, they found depictions of what they ended up calling the Mars beast. So I want to be clear, it's not the Mayans that called it the Mars beast. It's these particular archaeologists who, their argument is that what you see in that codex, in those pages where the Mars beast appears, is the beast coming down from the sky, making itself more visible, and then going back up. And what they argued is that what you're seeing there is Mars during an opposition. That's when the Earth, Mars, and Sun are lined up, and Mars is in its closest position to the Earth in its orbit, and it becomes larger and brighter in the sky, just as the Earth is passing it in our orbit, and we start to see Mars appear to change direction in the sky because of our relative motions as we are passing it. Because we move faster in our orbit than Mars does. And so what they were arguing is, this is Mars coming into opposition and then going into what astronomers call retrograde motion, that seeming change in direction before it starts going the normal direction again. So so the Mars beast may have been a depiction of what was happening in the sky. And again, according to these archaeologists, looking in the Dresden Codex, what they believe they're seeing is a connection between that occurrence, which happens about every couple of years, and a change in the tropical growing seasons.
We look at the Chinese version of Mars, gazing on Mars. This is the Qin Dynasty, and before that, the Han Dynasty. And they were looking for the patterns of heavens. As with the Mayans, the color red is important. You can see it without a telescope that it's red. However, the Chinese had a well-developed understanding. Again, I don't want to use English language, but it appears that they're projecting human emotions onto Mars. Is that a fair generalization of what the Mayans and the Chinese are doing?
Well, they were definitely, if you want to sort of think about it this way, anthropomorphizing them, right? They were giving the planets a certain amount of agency. They were making them participants in their world. They were giving them a role in communicating, from the celestial or heavenly part of the world down to Earth. So yeah, they were at once part of the natural world, but also sort of related to something more divine in their ability to either, reenact important events of the gods or to communicate from the gods down to the people on Earth. And for the ancient Chinese in the Han and Qing dynasty, they had sort of inherited from thousands of years of observing the sky before written records, this idea that a good ruler found harmony with the sky, with the earth, with events in both places, and was able to achieve that harmony and achieve peace, and that the heavens and what was happening in the heavens were at the same time sort of warnings about problems to come, but also signs that things were in alignment. So you were always looking to see that that the rule was legitimate, that the ruler himself was making the right choices. And so this was one way in which Chinese society was able to hold leaders accountable, was through astronomy and astrology. And it was one of the main reasons why, both in the case of the Maya and in the Chinese case, why kings and emperors supported financially astronomy and astrology, and created this class of educated astronomers and astrologers, essentially priests, who would study the sky closely and look for signs of trouble or of harmony.
Not just war, but the Chinese found robbery, sickness, mourning, famine, warfare. Let's go immediately to the Mesopotamians, who see omens. And I write down one sentence you provided for us: in the belief of omens lies the birth of science. That's very poetic, Matt.
Yeah, well, I can't take credit for it. That was another historian of science, Noel Swerdlow, said that. And what he was saying was that the Babylonians supported an incredibly large sort of army of astronomer astrologers who watched the sky very vigilantly and recorded not only everything they saw, but also everything that was happening around them when they saw that thing happen, so that they could build a catalog of what types of events on Earth went along with different events happening in the sky. And they also developed mathematical tools that allowed them to not necessarily describe the structure of the heavens, but predict where the planets would be on different nights. And that's what Swerdlow was saying, is that by looking so closely for those omens and keeping such detailed records and developing those mathematical tools, they essentially started acting like what we associate with science today, at least in terms of their development of mathematical tools. Culturally, of course, they were looking for something very different from what we are looking for when we look at the sky today. But in the terms of the sort of the thought process and the tools that they developed, Swerdlow was saying that they were essentially inventing science in that moment.
Plato, yes, sees the heavens and believes it's a reason for education. His student Aristotle divides everything that is. These are not physical worlds to them. They're part of everything in the world, into earth, water, air, and fire, and plus ether. Everything swims or exists in the ether. But Ptolemy's most important. You emphasize that he worked at the library in Alexandria. And Ptolemy comes up with a way of picturing the planets especially, but he can't solve it. He can't solve what they're observing naturally. And the Greeks now introduce, or the Greek world introduce, the next 2,000 years to whether the Earth is at the center of all of this, and the planets and the sun and the stars are moving around us, or whether something else is at the center. And Matt, where is Mars in this debate? Just one of the planets that they're observing, and they're not sure whether it's circling Earth or whether Earth and Mars are circling something else.
Well, for Aristotle, he was pretty certain that Mars was circling the Earth, because when he looked at the world, what he saw was, a physics that seemed specific to the world beneath the moon, right? He saw his four main elements, earth, water, air, and fire. He saw how they interacted with each other, and he saw that the general trend was for things to move either up or down in the sublunar world. And then when he looked at the heavens, everything from the moon and outward all he saw was circular motion. And so he thought, there must be something different about the heavens versus everything that's below the moon. There must be a special physics up there that prefers perfect circular motion. And so that's why he invented that fifth element, the ether, which had just different properties, different qualities that allowed it to behave differently from those four earthly or sublunar elements. And so once you've kind of adopted that structure and that physics for how things move, then it's very difficult to imagine a universe in which the Earth is orbiting the sun, since the Earth is made of these heavy elements and everything's moving up and down, and the heavens, on the other hand, are made of this special element that only moves in circles. And so, it was very difficult for folks who adopted that Aristotelian model to then imagine anything other than an Earth-centered universe. And so that was Ptolemy. Ptolemy was living well after Aristotle in the Roman Empire. He was, as you said, living in Alexandria, where he had access to all kinds of materials at the library and museum in Alexandria. And he started pulling together all of this ancient storehouse of knowledge into the book that he wrote that folks later in the medieval period would call the Almagest. It was a name given to that book by Islamic scholars that essentially meant the greatest, that this is the greatest book ever written about astronomy. And it was that book, the Almagest, and also another work of Ptolemy's called the Tetrabiblos, these four books about astrology, that came to define that medieval worldview for the Islamic world and then also for Christian Europe, giving them not only this structured heavens of these nested spheres with all of the planets, including Mars, moving in perfect circles, but also this knowledge about the significance of that, of what it meant when Mars or any other planet was in a different part of the sky or behaving in certain ways. And yeah, there were things that Ptolemy couldn't really explain very well, like that change in appearance of Mars or the retrograde motion of Mars. And Mars kind of sticks out like a sore thumb for a lot of medieval astronomers after Ptolemy, who were trying to apply this rule of perfect circular motion to the heavens, because Mars just, in many ways doesn't want to behave in that Earth-centered model.
Let's go to the medieval world. The book is For the Love of Mars. Matthew Shindell is the author, A Human History of the Red Planet. The medieval world inherits the understanding of the ancients and then astrology. But I go to one note of clarity. In Baghdad and Damascus, Matt informs us, between the 10th and the 16th century, which is the Dark Ages in the West, an age of feudal superstition. There are very careful observations of the planets and the stars. And Matt, this sure looks like science. Is that agreed upon, that what was going on in Baghdad and Damascus was scientific observation?
Yeah, we used to pretty much solely talk about a Renaissance happening in Europe later. Now it's pretty common for historians of science to talk about an earlier Renaissance that happens in the Islamic world, where all of this ancient knowledge, in addition to knowledge that is being brought from different corners of the Islamic Empire, there are libraries built, there's a large translation movement, and then there is original astronomical work being done as well. So there's definitely a lot of what we would recognize today as science and knowledge production happening in the Islamic world prior to that European Renaissance, that in many ways is seeded by the work that's being done in the Islamic world earlier. And it's a lot of these texts that are produced in the Islamic world, not only the ancient texts that are being translated, but commentaries on those texts and extrapolations of those texts into, more sort of contemporary to their time knowledge that ends up feeding that great Renaissance in the West. That if you think about what's happening in the West, people used to talk about this period as the Dark Ages, as a period in which, folks had no access to knowledge. In fact, what happens is after the Roman Empire collapses, in the western part of the empire, what becomes Europe, they have what one historian has called the light inheritance, or the light tradition of ancient science. They receive some, but not all. They have fragmentary texts, whereas in the eastern part of the empire, the Islamic world, they have a lot more access to complete texts and a lot more of the writings that didn't survive in the western part of the empire. And what happens, in the 12th, 13th century is all of that knowledge starts pouring in to Europe and completely transforming the educational system in Europe.
Mentioning Dante Alighieri and the Divine Comedy, a note here. Mars is associated with war, disaster, violence, mourning, except Dante. Dante sees Mars as fortitude. Were you surprised by that, Matt? We have about a minute.
Yeah, I was a little surprised by that. I mean, Dante does something really interesting. He's kind of, if you will, forced to make Mars more positive than it's usually depicted, because when he has come out of hell and purgatory, he's going now up into the heavenly spheres, and all of the planets now have to represent a virtue as opposed to a vice. And war doesn't seem like a great virtue. So what Dante does is he transforms it into fortitude. He keeps that connection to war by making Mars the heavenly sphere in which all of the people who died in holy war, all of the martyrs, are going to reside. And of course, their model, the greatest martyr of all time in Dante's mind and in Christian Europe, was Jesus Christ. And so Mars becomes this very special planet in embodying that sacrifice that Christ made on the cross in dying for God. So, it does become very important to Dante's world.
Why Dante is important is that book will be read dominantly over the next 1,000 years, still read carefully, imagining.
It's one of the most famous medieval texts ever produced, right?
For the Love of Mars, Matthew Shindell is the author. We're going to modern times, somewhere in the Renaissance. Matt, Descartes died 1650. Christian Huygens, Giovanni Cassini died 1712. Isaac Newton died 1726. These men, Leonhard Euler of all physics, these men put together what we understand to be science, following Galileo's groundbreaking martyrdom to what he saw through the telescope. All of this is going on simultaneously with them inheriting the old world. Were they seen as rebellious of the ancients when they provided these interpretations of observation and mathematics?
I think yes and no, right? Galileo didn't see himself necessarily as being rebellious. He thought he was still working within that same tradition, but trying to modernize it based on, new observations, new mathematics. Now, I don't want to try to get too deep into what Galileo really thought he was doing, but at least this is the way that he would describe it in letters that he wrote to his patrons. And, Galileo's observations of the moon certainly gave people a reason to think that there was something different going on in the heavens than what they had, inherited from Aristotle. And there did seem to be the need for some new ways of thinking about the solar system. But the truth is that, there were multiple models of the universe kind of circulating at that time, each kind of not seeming perfect, right? Not being the obvious choice for what was happening. You had the old Aristotelian model, or the Ptolemaic model, with the Earth at the center. You then had Tycho Brahe's model, where you had the Earth at the center, but everything else but the moon orbiting around the sun. And then finally, you had this Copernican model, which was great mathematically, but it still didn't really line up perfectly with observation. So, we have this period during what we call the scientific revolution, where there's not really an obvious answer, and it's actually a very slow transformation into what we have today that involves, not just the observations that Galileo was making, but new physics of the heavens that Newton contributes, new mathematics that the Oilers contribute. And eventually that all kind of adds up to something we recognize today as our modern solar system. But it doesn't happen overnight. The scientific revolution, if we want to still call it that, is a very slow revolution.
Matt mentions Tycho Brahe. He had really good eyesight because he spotted a new star in 1572. This is Matt's reporting, and a comet in 1577 without a telescope. But we come immediately to the 18th century because there's lots of lifting going on now. I think Newton describes the thinking for me always. We give him enormous credit for Newtonian physics, but he spent most of his time in alchemy, searching for manufacturing gold from elements that he could compile, including, I think, apples. So he was a man of two thinkings about the heavens. But in the 18th century, we have men who are doing observation and coming to conclusions about Mars. That is what's striking about this. The Comte de Buffon and the Comte de Laplace, both Frenchmen, can see Mars, can see the planets. What do they make of it? What is their projection, Matt?
Well, I mean, during this period, there's a lot of Enlightenment thinking about the solar system and where it came from. And there is this effort, on the part of Buffon and later Laplace to try and imagine a natural cause for the creation of the universe, as opposed to, a divine cause or there being a heavenly creator. And so, what they try to start looking for is how can you apply just natural phenomena to try and understand where things might have come from and how they would have been put into motion so that you have all of these planets orbiting the sun. And, this is really the beginning of starting to think about the planets as having all been created in the same event from natural processes, and all of them basically having the same physics and a family relationship to each other, having all come from the same stuff and obeying the same laws. So it's this extension of Galileo's observation and Newton's new physics now being applied to what we might call sort of a natural history of the planets and how they evolve over time.
Martians, Mars, all of a sudden, I was surprised to see it comes out of the Herschels, William and Caroline Herschel. They're tracking nebulae, which we now understand to be galaxies. They didn't understand that at the time. That won't be till the 20th century. But the Herschels believed that Mars, do I have this correct, was inhabited and it had an atmosphere, it had citizens, and we're observing it with telescopes. Is that correct?
They weren't doing very much direct observation of Mars, but the Herschels did have this idea that that planets were born as a normal process of the evolution of a star. That stars were born, they developed planets, and then eventually that star died and the whole process started over again. And Herschel did conclude, William Herschel, based on what other astronomers had reported and maybe a few of his own observations, that that Mars was probably incredibly Earth-like, maybe the most Earth-like planet in the solar system, and likely did have life forms very much like what we have on Earth. I'm not sure how far he went in terms of whether those were intelligent civilizations, but he definitely thought that Mars wouldn't be too different from Earth. I mean, he thought that all planets were probably inhabited, because that was actually a pretty common belief throughout the Enlightenment, that why would God create a planet if it wasn't going to be inhabited by some form of life? Why waste that space? And so, yeah, Herschel was pretty convinced that even stars might have some forms of life on them.
The man Robert Chambers, Matt takes me to places where I've never been. Robert Chambers, he calls a modern Dante, died 1871. He writes a book called Vestiges, which appears from your telling, I've not read the book or seen it even in physical form, to be a projection of the world he lives in on the heavens. Is that how to read this? Almost as if a dystopian romance.
Yeah, I mean, historians of biology usually read Chambers' Vestiges of the History of Natural Creation. And they read it because it comes out, not long before not long before Darwin published his On the Origin of Species. And it's kind of seen as this moment when evolution becomes part of the discourse and becomes this intellectual object that folks argue over publicly, and it kind of lays the groundwork for Darwin's argument to emerge. But if you read it more broadly, it's really this history of an attempt to extend that argument about the natural history of the universe, and to really talk about how things could go from nothing to everything, essentially, to this incredible solar system with all of these planets and life maybe here, maybe everywhere. What Chambers is trying to do is just tell a complete evolutionary story of essentially everything.
And we now move to Mars in specific. A man named Richard Proctor writes a book called Other Worlds Than Ours. And then the very important Giovanni Schiaparelli, died 1910, observes the canals of Mars. What it feels like, Matt, as an amateur reader, is that we've gone from the ancients, who did not see Mars as a physical world, and saw it as an expression to be interpreted along with everything else in the heavens, to the specific need of Mars to be just like us, except alien, possibly a competitor. And Schiaparelli doesn't go that far. He just observes canals. I think as a child, that's the first I knew of Mars. It had canals. Do you remember hearing the first time about Mars, Matt?
Oh, well, I was born in 1976. I like to point that out because that's the same year that the Viking landers landed on the surface of Mars. So the Mars that I've grown up with has pretty much always been a land of rock that looks a lot like, the American Southwest, but that is, essentially a frozen desert landscape. So canals, I didn't learn about canals on Mars until later in life when I, read some of the work of Edgar Rice Burroughs, right? His Barzoom novels. That was the first that I saw canals. So I didn't really grow up with those in my sort of imagination.
Well, I mentioned that before the success of the NASA probe programs, those of us born in the 1940s and before, which pretty much describes the young and old senior leadership at NASA in the 20th century.
Yeah.
It was Edgar Rice Burroughs and the canals of Mars and the Princess of Mars. That's how we saw it. It was magical, and that's all about Schiaparelli. So let's go back to another influencer of us in the late 20th century, Percival Lowell. Mm-hmm. I had always associated Lowell with breakthroughs in science. He had an imagination.
Yeah, he certainly did. And we talk about him today as an astronomer who built an observatory in Flagstaff. And, some people treat him a little bit as an embarrassment to astronomy, others as a great patron and great scientist. But in fact, he did have an imagination. In fact, he was a travel writer before he became an astronomer. And he was very interested throughout his whole life in this idea of the evolution of the planets, and that there was this relationship between Earth and Mars. And what he saw through the telescope when he looked at Mars wasn't just canals. What he saw was, a possible future for life on Earth, because Mars had just sort of aged more quickly, essentially because of its size. And what we were looking at there was what we were going to eventually be looking at on Earth, which is that the deserts that already populated the Earth were going to get larger, and the Earth was going to become more characterized by desert landscapes over time. And so, Lowell was looking at Mars, but he was also looking at the future, in his mind.
Yes, again, it's that projection about could that be our future? Of course, H.G. Wells did that magnificently by creating monsters who pretty much, as you observe ironically, reproduce the destruction power of the British Empire in the 19th century.
Yeah, look, H.G. Wells was one of the first writers to really think about Martians as not just sort of altered versions of humans who would have the same thoughts and the same dreams, but as something completely alien and Martian. And when they came to Earth in War of the Worlds, they barely even recognized the intelligent life of Earth. They came just for the resources. And yeah, H.G. Wells is basically saying in that book to his fellow members of the British Empire, this is essentially what we do when we go out into the world. And how does it feel to think about this being done to us? So it was, on the one hand, a great science fiction book in that it took astronomy seriously and the idea of life on another world very seriously. But then it was also a great satire through which he could hold up the kind of the ugliness of the British Empire to his readers.
Matt Shindell is the author. For the Love of Mars is the book, A Human History of the Red Planet. The robots, the program's wave after wave of conquest, probing Mars, first a flyby with Mariner, then orbiters, then landers, now rovers, and of course, Ingenuity, the brave little toaster that flies on the surface of Mars. This comes out of the Cold War. And Matt, you make an ironic point that the Cold War came to a moment where the US had successfully defeated the Soviets in the race to the moon. And a presentation was made by NASA to then Nixon administration to reproduce the Apollo program on Mars. What happened, Matt?
Yeah, so, there was this moment within NASA where the success of the Apollo program to many was sort of an indication that NASA was so good at what it did that it should continue to basically push the envelope to continue with the same level of funding and continue the U.S. leadership in space by moving from the moon to Mars with a similar program. But the politics at home were not really suitable for that, right? Like the U.S. public had enjoyed the Apollo program, but had not always been happy with the amount of money that it actually took to get humans to the moon. And Nixon, who was president at the time, he felt the political winds changing. He felt that it was important to shift focus to more domestic issues like poverty, like civil rights, other issues that were becoming important to the American people or had been already important. But, with Apollo having been a success, it was time, he felt, to kind of pull back and make space exploration have to compete with other national priorities. And that's essentially where we get NASA of today, with its post-Apollo budget levels never going back up to, the levels that in the Cold War really expressed that space was not just a priority, but the top national priority in competition with the Soviet Union.
But really good robots, Matt. Really good.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, because one of the things that's happening throughout that whole history of the Apollo program is a very successful robotic exploration program at both the moon and Mars. And, those Mariner probes that you mentioned going to Mars in the 1960s and early 70s, they were so successful and improved so much from mission to mission that by the time you get from Mariner 4, the first visit to Mars, to then Mariner 9, the first spacecraft to go into orbit around Mars, the technology has improved so much that the images coming back and the amount of information coming back from Mars in the early 70s was, and still is kind of mind-blowing given the technology of its time. And then in the mid 70s, when the Viking landers land on Mars and, humans on Earth are able to, for the first time, operate on the surface of Mars and, do science with the rocks, with the soil that are there at the landing site, that completely transforms ideas about what we're actually capable of doing in space exploration with robots. And then, of course, we have this great pause in Mars exploration for about 2 decades after after Viking lands on Mars. And, then in the 1990s, we start going back to Mars with a vengeance, with even better robotic technologies. First with the small Sojourner rover in 1997, and then with Spirit and Opportunity in 2004, followed by the incredibly successful Curiosity rover in 2012, and then now more recently, Perseverance and its little friend, which you've mentioned, Ingenuity, which has proven that not only can we drive on the surface of Mars, we can actually fly if you're, at least low enough in that atmosphere to get some lift.
Elon Musk says that he wants to be on the surface of Mars to die, and he wants to be there by 2059, I believe is the date. There are many unanswered questions about traveling to Mars. Do you agree, Matt? We have about 30 seconds.
Yeah, a human mission to Mars is a whole other ball game, because you have to keep those humans alive during the entire trip to Mars. And then once they get to Mars, you have to provide them with a suitable shelter where they're going to be safe from that radiation and other hazards on Mars, and also have enough food to survive for the period that they'd have to stay on Mars until the two planets, Earth and Mars, are back in alignment to, suitable for a return trip. So it's an incredibly ambitious mission.
A big question mark, but for the love of Mars, Matthew Shindell, A Human History of the Red Planet, the Early Days. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.